Ben Shapiro is wrong about transgenderism. One claim that you'll hear him make is that transgenderism is a mental illness. For example, in a panel conversation about transgenderism, he had the following to say.
The entire discussion is whether we are embracing mental illness and delusion as a society. That's the entire discussion.
Now, this claim that he's making here, that transgenderism, it's a mental illness, it's indicative of delusions, this is something that the medical and the psychological community flatly rejects. For example, the American Psychological Association in a February 2021 resolution said the following, quote, "Diversity in gender identity and expression is part of the human experience, and transgender and gender non-binary identities and expressions are healthy. Incongruence between one's sex and gender is neither pathological nor a mental health disorder." End quote. Now, this is not a Tumblr post from Trigglypuff that I just read to you. This is not some crackpot leftist who is foaming at the mouth and screaming at you. This is the American Psychological Association saying, no, transgenderism, it's not a mental illness, it's not indicative of delusions. In fact, it's perfectly healthy and it's perfectly normal. In fact, the real irony here is that the only sense in which transgenderism is currently pathologized by the medical or psychological community is when a transgender person doesn't act out on those transgender impulses and feelings, and instead represses it and pushes it down to a degree that it causes psychological harm to them. The American Medical Association, in a 2019 publication, along with 14 other medical healthcare organizations, they had the following to say on the subject. Quote, "Many transgender individuals experience a condition called gender dysphoria, which is characterized by clinically significant distress resulting from the incongruence between one's gender identity and the sex assigned to the individual at birth. The international consensus among healthcare professionals regarding treatment for gender dysphoria is to assist the patient to live in accordance with the patient's gender identity, thus alleviating the distress or impairment." End quote. So just take a moment to appreciate the irony here on this point. What conservatives claim is that it's the acting out of transgenderism that's the mental illness. That's what they claim is delusional. When a person thinks this way, feels this way, and acts in accordance with the internal experience that they have. In the medical community, number one, they say this is just not true to claim that transgenderism is mental illness. That's something they reject. But in addition to that, they say number two, it's actually repressing this transgenderism that leads to the mental distress that can be classed as pathological. So what conservatives are recommending here, accept your sex at birth, cast off these delusions that you're having about being a woman trapped in a man's body, and, just accept the fact that you're a man. The recommendation that conservatives are making here, the medical community is saying, no, this is actually what causes the psychological harm to these people in many cases. So really, they just have it completely backwards. In that same document, the American Medical Association and, again, 14 other healthcare, mental health organizations, they said the following, quote, "The medical profession's understanding of gender has advanced considerably over the past 50 years. Throughout much of the 20th century, individuals who were not gender conforming were often viewed as perverse or deviant. Practices during that period tried to correct this perceived deviance by attempting to force transgender people to live in accordance with the sex assigned to them at birth. These efforts failed and caused significant harm to the individuals subjected to them." End quote. So as with so many different issues, this quote really illustrates that conservatives are just stuck in the past on this issue. And, the way that it works in science is that as we learn more information, newer information, better information, we tend to move forward and change our views along with it, and this is really something that conservatives should just try sometime. Now, I could go on and on quoting the medical community on how transgenderism is not a mental illness, it's not delusional, it's not indicative of any, fucked up mental state like Republicans claim, but here are just a couple more quotes. These from the American Psychological Association. Quote, "Transgender and gender non-binary people whose gender has been affirmed report increased quality of life. Self-determination in defining one's gender identity is a source of resilience for transgender and gender non-binary people and associated with improvements in well-being and reductions in psychological distress. Individuals who have experienced gender-affirming psychological and medical practices report improved psychological functioning, quality of life, treatment retention and engagement, and reductions in psychological distress, gender dysphoria, and maladaptive coping mechanisms." End quote. Now, there's a video where Ben Shapiro, he was at a recent Q&A session, and somebody explained to him this consensus among the psychological community, the medical community, the healthcare community, about how transgenderism, it's not a mental illness like he claims, and it's actually in fact normal and psychologically healthy for these people. They explained this to him, and, he basically got painted into a corner where he was forced to say that, yes, he explicitly rejects this consensus among all the relevant expert organizations. Let's watch.
Why do you believe you're right about trans people given the American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, American Psychoanalytic Association, I can go on for about 5 more associations that are very prominent and govern the existing health government or health industries within the major Western countries. And all of these associations have multiple thousands of doctors, sociologists, psychologists, and with PhDs in their respective fields backing the idea that sex and gender are different, effectively gaining the medical consensus for sex and gender being 2 different concepts, yet you have a different opinion.
I will just say that anyone who suggests that gender has no reference whatsoever to biology, it's not connected in any way to biology, is just full of shit. Because if the the reason I and the reason that I say
then you actually just disagree with medical consensus
yes,
within the Western
disagree. Yes, I disagree with the false medical consensus driven by politically driven, quote unquote, doctors. If any doctor denies to me that there is a dichotomy between male and female, a sexual dichotomy between male and female, they are ignorant and they are letting their politics get in the way of their science.
Now, take a moment to just think about what we saw there. What we're talking about here are all of the most relevant and most esteemed organizations in the country that are most qualified to weigh in on the subject. We're talking about psychological organizations, we're talking about medical organizations, we're talking about mental health organizations. The best people who are most qualified to weigh in on the subject and determine whether it is or is not a mental illness. And they're saying, no, it's not. It's totally normal and fine and healthy for these people. And Ben Shapiro just dismisses all of these organizations. He just dismisses this consensus. The best he has is some flimsy, pathetic excuse about how they've been politicized. These organizations, they've just become politicized, is what he said. Now, whenever you hear a conservative or Republican make some sort of excuse like this where they're like, the science has become politicized in this field, translate that in your head to the scientific conclusions and facts in this field disagree with my preconceived beliefs. Because really, that's what they mean here. Like they do it on climate science as well, where, you show them how all the relevant expert organizations that study this, they tell us, yeah, man-made emissions are driving climate change. Republicans, they do the same thing, where they're just like, oh yeah, climate scientists, they lie for grant money. It's been politicized. I'm sure they're just fabricating their data. Like, they just make some shit up to dismiss the scientific conclusions and facts that are just uncomfortable for them. And, we see Shapiro doing this here regarding transgenderism. Now, what I would invite you to ask yourself is, what if we had the opposite situation here? Like, what if all of these organizations, what if the American Medical Association and the American Psychological Association and the American Psychiatric Association and all the other fucking relevant expert associations in this country, what if they were coming out and publishing reports saying transgenderism, it's a dangerous mental illness, these people are delusional freaks who need to be, locked in a padded cell and given really severe, intensive treatment to help them overcome this very harmful mental illness that they have. If all these organizations were saying this in the country, do you think Ben Shapiro would be claiming, oh, these organizations, can't trust them, they've been politicized? You think he would be making these kind of excuses and dismissing what they're saying? Not a fucking chance. He would be coming out every fucking day on the Ben Shapiro show and waving the studies in front of us. Well, actually, the American Psychological Association. Every fucking day he would be talking about it. Steven Crowder, Lauren Southern, they would be proclaiming from the mountaintops, look what these organizations are claiming about how transgenderism is dangerous. They would not be dismissing it or brushing it off or ignoring it or trying to talk around it. They're only doing this because the facts and the science and the conclusions in this field are inconvenient for them. And it's like, Ben Shapiro, conservatives, they love to say facts over feelings. They're all about like facts and logic, and he just destroyed you with facts. I mean, what does this say about his commitment to so-called facts over feelings? You show him the facts. You show him all of the most fucking qualified experts and the leading organizations in this nation that specialize in this and focus on this. Here are the facts, Mr. Shapiro. And he's like, I feel like these organizations have become politicized. I feel like I'm still right about this, even though these are the scientific facts. I mean, for all their talk about how they prioritize the facts over the feelings, when it actually fucking comes down to it, show them a fact that goes against what they've already decided to believe, and they're just going to make up any bullshit, fabricated excuse to just eliminate it. Also, what's funny about that video clip is, if you look in the comments section, this is a video where Ben Shapiro, confronted with the scientific consensus of all the expert organizations, he says, yeah, I don't agree with that, I dismiss it. All the people in the comment section are saying how he destroyed this person with facts and logic. And it's just like, dude, this is what passes for brilliant analysis on the right wing these days. Overt, explicit, open science denialism. Here's what all the experts are saying. All the most qualified organizations. Yeah, I don't agree with that. I think all of these experts are wrong. And they're just like, yes, wrecked. You got ruined, liberal. And I'm just like, dude, what fucking planet are we living on? Where, just overt science denialism is like fucking owned. He owns the lib by denying science. I'm just like, what the fuck, dude? Like, what planet are these people living on? Probably the most important thing regarding the whole, like, mental illness argument is that, when conservatives make this argument, you need to understand this is not their decision to make. It is not up to right-wing opinion columnist Ben Shapiro to go about ascertaining what is or isn't a mental illness. Like, there are mental health professionals and fucking psychologists and medical experts whose entire career it is to study this shit and research it and make these sort of determinations about, what the criteria is for mental illness and, like, looking at the symptoms and psychological states of this versus that to make these sort of determinations. And, for all that Republicans, they like to say shit like, stay in your lane, shut up and dribble. And it's just like, for all that fucking shut up and dribble talk, you guys, you have a pretty awfully fucking bad habit of weighing in on subjects where you're just not fucking qualified to override what the experts are saying. Imagine you're having some sort of, like, mental issues personally. Like, you're driving at night and it's like you're having these weird, flashes and hallucinations and, like, maybe your memory is skipping or whatever. Just some weird neurological symptoms where it's like, I should go visit a doctor for this and get checked up because, I'm thinking there might be something wrong with my brain. I'm a little worried here, actually. And you go visit a doctor and you tell him all the symptoms that you're having, and he's like, interesting, yes, this is very interesting, I'm actually going to refer you to a Ben Shapiro Q&A session. You'd be like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? Like, I need to go see a specialist to figure out, what's going on with my brain and psychological state, and if this is something to be worried about. I don't need to fucking listen to what some Republican fucking radio host thinks about this. I mean, the doctor is like, well, I've seen this before, and my recommendation, what I'm going to prescribe to you, is some Steven Crowder YouTube videos. I mean, you'd be like, what the fuck is going on here? Like, this guy would get sued for malpractice so fast that your fucking head would spin. But that you have all these Republicans and these radio hosts weighing in on shit where they're just not qualified to discuss it and make these sort of determinations. And it's equally as absurd as imagining something like that. Like, in psychology and mental health, there's something called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is used, by, like, psychologists and mental health experts. It's basically this big fucking, like, central database of all the different mental conditions and mental illnesses and, like, symptoms and criterias and, treatment methods and stuff like that, that they all sort of universally consult to, like, look at this stuff and understand it and diagnose them and so forth. And I've got news for you. Ben Shapiro is not the fucking person that writes this. It's like experts in this field come together and collaborate and work on this. And it's like Ben Shapiro trying to fucking weigh in on this. It would be equally as absurd as him trying to, like, give a lecture about, the technical details of, like, a schizophrenia diagnosis or whatever. You'd be like, what is this guy even fucking talking about trying to weigh in on this? Like, what do you know about this fucking subject that the experts and the PhDs and the researchers in this field who have dedicated their fucking lives to it, like specializing in very narrow subfields where they just, really narrowly laser in on one thing for a fucking 50-year career. What could right-wing radio host Ben Shapiro possibly add to this fucking conversation that like they wouldn't already have thought of or be aware of. Just the arrogance to try to weigh in like this and just override what the experts are saying and just dismiss what they're telling you and say, I know more than the combined expertise of all these fucking PhDs and researchers. Just the arrogance and the foolishness of this is, I think, quite hilarious. So really, this is the decision that we're left with here at this point. On the one hand, we have all of the nation's most relevant and highly esteemed psychological, mental health, medical healthcare organizations. All of these organizations versus right-wing opinion columnist Ben Shapiro. I mean, what a fucking toss-up, dude. Like, I don't know which one to go with. It's a really tough decision. Are you saying scientists are perfect? Are you saying the scientific consensus has never been wrong before? Obviously, I'm not saying, like, oh, scientists have never gotten it wrong. But I think to dismiss the scientific consensus because it's conceivable that scientists could be wrong based on the logic that they've been wrong in the past. Therefore, anything scientists tell us, it's just, it's a free-for-all. It's kind of, a cafeteria, just pick and choose what you want to believe and what agrees with your preconceived beliefs. That, I think, is stupid. And I also think if the tables were turned, like I said earlier, and these organizations were supporting the Shapiro case, they would not be resorting to this sort of scientific relativism and this kind of nonsense. If anyone is most likely to get it right at a given time, it's going to be the experts in the field who specialize in this domain. And when they're all telling us the same thing, it makes more sense to listen to them versus a right-wing opinion columnist. That's the way I look at this, and really that's the fucking way that anyone should look at this, because it makes sense. One additional thing to consider here on this, this claim that transgenderism, it's a mental illness. People used to make the same claim about homosexuality. Still to this day, you have, like, the pastors and the crackpots who talk about, like, pray the gay away. And, there are still the homosexual deniers who are like, you're actually deep down a heterosexual, and, it's just Satan whispering in your ear, and you're just denying these inner impulses. So, some people still do believe this nonsense, and, I'm sure a lot of them are, like, best friends with Ben Shapiro. No. But the point is, people used to make the same claim about homosexuality in the past. And, even a lot of people in the medical community, they used to pathologize it and think about it like, what's wrong with these people? Clearly, there's something wrong with their mental state. It's kind of a standard reactionary societal response against anything new and outside of our experience to sort of push back against it because it's not what we're used to and it makes us uncomfortable. But, society, science, the medical community, as they tend to learn more, they become more accepting and understanding. And again, this is something that conservatives are always very slow to adapt to and catch up to. Ben Shapiro will sometimes argue that the high suicide rate among transgender individuals is not from a lack of acceptance in society. It doesn't come from bullying or anything like that. And instead, he'll argue that it's in fact indicative of the mental illness that he claims they have. Let's watch.
The idea behind the transgender movement as a civil rights movement is the idea that all of their problems would just go away if I would pretend that they were the sex to which they claim membership. That's nonsense. The transgender suicide rate is 40%. It is 40%. And according to the Anderson School at UCLA, it makes no difference. There's a study that came out last year. It makes no difference, virtually no difference, statistically speaking, as to whether people recognize you as a transgender person or not, which suggests there's a very high comorbidity between transgenderism, whatever that mental state may be, and suicidality. That has nothing to do with how society treats you.
Do you think it could be because of they're bullied at school?
No, I don't think that. I do not think that the discrepancy. I do not think the discrepancy. First of all, I'm against bullying of any sort. Okay, the idea that somebody would beat somebody up is terrible. Okay, as somebody who's viciously bullied in high school, I'm not a fan of bullying. But the idea that the normal suicide rate across the United States is 4%. The suicide rate in the transgender community is 40%. The idea that 36% more transgender people are committing suicide because people are mean to them is ridiculous. It's not true, and it's not backed by any science that anyone can cite. It is pure conjecture. In fact, it's not even true that bullying causes suicide, according to a lot of studies. For example, in the black community, where the idea is supposedly that America is a racist society, blacks are bullied a lot. Okay, in the black community has significantly lower suicide rates than in the white community. In fact, in third world countries, the suicide rate is significantly lower than in first world countries. Suicide actually seems to be a privilege of the upper classes if you actually look at it from a financial perspective. So the idea that suicidality is directly a result of people like me saying, no, men are not women and women are not men, it's not true.
Now, one way that you can tell this argument is bullshit is because this is not a transgender-only problem here, this elevated suicide rate. If you look at the gay community and the bisexual community, their suicide rate is also higher than heterosexuals. For example, there's a 2009 study by Nathaniel Lewis, which found that the suicide rate of gays and bisexuals was consistently higher than heterosexuals. And what's especially interesting about the study is you can actually see the gap has been steadily decreasing over time within the United States. As society has become more accepting and understanding and tolerant of homosexuality and bisexuality, and it's a pretty obvious trend that you see here. There's another study, it's a 2014 study by Wendy Bostwick et al., which found that the suicide attempt rates of gays and bisexuals is about 4 times higher than heterosexuals. So what I want to know, by the Shapiro logic that he's using here, where, he says the suicide rate of transgenders, it's very high relative to heterosexuals or the general population. So, therefore he claims it's indicative of mental illness or delusions that they're having or something pathological. What I want to know is, looking at the same data on the homosexual and bisexual community, would he argue the same thing? Would he say this is clearly proof that there's some sort of mental illness that's, there's a comorbidity between homosexuality and suicidality? And, would he perhaps hint and surmise at the fact that, that maybe both the homosexuality and the suicidality are somehow linked to some underlying mental illness on their part? Because it's really the same logic that he's applying to transgenders, so I don't see why he wouldn't make the same case about the gay community as well, because really it's the same logic. I would argue it's quite obvious that the suicide rates of the transgender community, it's very obviously a byproduct of these people not yet being fully accepted among society. Even with homosexuals, for example, look at all of the rampant anti-homosexuality that's out there, still to this day. Anti-gay Republican politicians and so-called intellectuals, telling them that they don't deserve equal rights, saying, you don't have the right to get married, and it's one man, one woman, and really treating them like second-class citizens. You look at you turn on a TV on the fucking weekend, and you have some anti-gay televangelist who's ranting and raving about, the evils and the ills of homosexuality and how these people are sinners and they're going to go to hell. These people, they're constantly told that something is wrong with them. They're disgusting. They don't deserve equal rights. And it's like, you don't think that has something to fucking do with it? Like half the country not accepting them and fundamentally rejecting them as humans. You don't think that might have something to do with the elevated suicide rates? With transgenders, it's the same thing, but it's actually much worse because they're much less accepted than homosexuals and bisexuals are. Everywhere you look, you go onto fucking YouTube, turn the radio on, tune into some Ben Shapiro, hop onto social media. It's non-stop anti-trans arguments. Basically half the country makes fun of them, mocks them, treats them like freaks, tells them they have a mental illness, says something is wrong with these delusional weirdos. They're compared to creeps and perverts who put on a fucking dress and sexually assault people in bathrooms. And then these same people who disparage them every chance they get in all these different mediums with all these different forms of mockery and disparagement, they then turn around and they're like, what's wrong with these people? Why is their suicide rate so high? Like, clearly it's some sort of fucking mental problem that they have. And I'm just like, dude, maybe it has something to do with the fact that half the country is such a big fucking asshole to these people all the time. Like, you don't think a lack of acceptance in the very country and community that you live in might have something to fucking do with it? Now, on the one hand, I think that data that we saw with gays and bisexuals versus heterosexuals, the suicide rate, I think that supports this hypothesis, because what you see is that as society has become more accepting and less hostile, the suicide rate has gone down. And to me, this is like the least fucking surprising finding in all of human history. Because how intuitive is this? That like, wow, people not treating you like subhuman trash makes you want to kill yourself less. Just fucking groundbreaking stuff. When it comes to homosexuals and transsexuals, there's actually direct research on this point that you can point to. For example, a 2019 survey by the Trevor Project found that the LGBT youth suicide rate was higher for those who had no accepting adults versus those who had at least one accepting adult. 27% versus 17%. And then you can also look at the 2015 US Transgender survey, and you find the following. Quote, 11% of respondents who had been rejected from their families reported past year suicide attempts, compared against 5% of those who had not experienced such rejection reported attempts in the past year. They also found 13% of respondents who had been denied equal treatments because they are transgender reported suicide attempts in the past year, compared against 6% of those who had not experienced such treatment reported past year attempts. In addition, 30% of respondents who were physically attacked in a public place reported attempting suicide in the past year, compared against 7% of those who were not similarly attacked reported past year attempt. And finally, 9% of respondents who wanted but did not receive gender-affirming care reported past year suicide attempts, compared against 5% of those who wanted and received gender-affirming care reported attempts in the past year. And this last finding, of course, it gets back to that earlier point that, it's the repressing and the denying of transgenderism that's psychologically damaging. And so, the conservative advice on this, it's bad advice. And just look at all of this data as a whole, and it's very clear that the more accepting people are, the less likely transgenders are to kill themselves. And conversely, the more hostile people are, the more rejecting they are, the more sometimes overtly violent they are, the more likely they are to kill themselves. So if you actually look at the data, it definitely supports the hypothesis that, contrary to what Shapiro claims, the lack of acceptance in society does strongly appear to contribute to the suicide rate. Which, again, it's like, how is this fucking surprising to anybody? Now, Shapiro's response and sort of counter-argument to this was, he claims that studies show bullying is not a strong contributor to suicide rates. And, regarding bullying specifically, I'm sure there's tons of conflicting research on this point, and it's really beyond the scope of this video to get into that. But we're not talking about just mere bullying here. This isn't like pull your fucking pants down and take your lunch money type of shit. We're talking about the country you live in, half of the fucking nation doesn't fundamentally accept you as a person. They treat you like a freak and a weirdo and compare you to sexual deviants and perverts, molesting people in bathrooms. Just half of society, disparaging them and mocking them and treating them like trash. This is very different from just grade school bullying that somebody would experience, in the hallways or the locker rooms of a fucking grade school. So whatever the research is on bullying specifically, that's not even what we're talking about. So really that's kind of a red herring to even bring that up, as if it refutes the claim that's being made here. And I think by doing this, it's pretty clear that Shapiro is really trying to just wash his hands of any responsibility for transgender suicide rates in this country. And I really do think that conservatives like Ben Shapiro and Steven Crowder and Lauren Southern, they do a lot to contribute to this climate of anti-transgenderism. I mean, they're some of the most forceful public advocates with the absolute biggest fucking platforms who talk about the subject more than, honestly, anyone I can fucking think of. All the people who get their arguments on anti-transgenderism, they tend to get them from one of these three people. So they really do help to create, to a large extent, this anti-trans atmosphere, which does drive a lot of them to suicide. It's comparable to anti-gay preachers and stuff, talking about the evils of homosexuality and so forth. It's different, but it's similar in that regard, to where it's you're making people not feel accepted and you're contributing to this negative atmosphere. So I'm not saying that it's the only factor, and it's every time a transgender person kills themselves, I blame Ben Shapiro, and it's they have blood on their hands for that specific suicide or whatever. It's obviously lots of factors go into suicide, and sometimes it's getting violently attacked might push you over the edge or whatever the fuck it is. There's a lot of factors that go into it, so let's not twist my words here. But I don't see how you could argue that some of the most forceful anti-transgender individuals with the biggest platforms wouldn't contribute to this climate that pushes people to suicide. So he tries to wash his hands here of it, but I definitely think him and other conservatives do contribute to this. Overall, just looking at, the conservative analysis regarding transgenderism and the suicide rates, I think pretending like society rejecting you doesn't play a role at all. It's just you're intentionally playing stupid, and it's just kind of ridiculous. And to dismiss all of these factors we talked about, all the data points about getting violently attacked or getting rejected, by people and so forth, to just dismiss all of that and just chalk it up to, it's like, haha, proof that these people are mentally ill, like I keep telling you. To me, that's very cruel, that's very stupid, and it's just not at all what the research on the subject points to. Ben Shapiro will sometimes claim that his anti-transgender arguments and viewpoints are grounded in biology and science, pointing to things like chromosomes, and ultimately, the case that he makes is that the science proves his position and backs what he's saying. For example, here's what Shapiro said in a panel about transgenderism.
It turns out that every chromosome, every cell in Caitlyn Jenner's body is male with the exception of some of his sperm cells.
And he also said the following in one of his famous Owning the Libs videos.
But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
Now, it's important to distinguish here between two different things. The internal, cognitive, or psychological experience and state that a person has, and their chromosomes. There's no necessary biological reason that the two necessarily must be 100% correlated with one another. Because, the case conservatives make is it's like, somebody who's born a male at birth has the male chromosomes. And so logically from that, the argument they make is therefore the internal psychological cognitive state of this person must also be male and correspond to what the chromosomes are. And, really there's just so much more to psychology and cognition and conscious experience than just your mere chromosomes. Like there can be genetic factors that play a role, there can be epigenetic factors, there can be developmental factors, environmental factors, cultural factors, and just to look at the chromosomes and be like, your psychological state must always therefore perfectly correlate with that. There's really no psychological or biological or neurological reason why that's necessarily the case. Regarding transgenderism specifically, the American Psychiatric Association, they claim that some of the contributing factors that actually lead some people to become transgender could be genetic influences, sometimes it could be prenatal hormone levels, sometimes early experiences in life, likely some combination of all three of these factors. And what they don't claim is, your psychological state must 100% correspond to, the chromosomes that you have. And therefore the psychological state must go with it. There's really no reason for there to be that sort of 100% congruence like that, or to demand the sort of perfect alignment between the two. We're talking about cognition here, perception, psychology, brain development. And, to reduce this really complex part of the human experience and, brain development and all that shit to just like 100% it must match up with your chromosomes. Biologically, there's no reason for this. And, brain science and psychology, it's generally much more complicated than that. A good analogy for understanding this is to look at homosexuality. Because you can't genetically confirm a homosexual psychological state. Like, somebody tells you he's gay and he's attracted to men. You can't sequence his genome and be like, yep, there's the gay gene. And so therefore, yes, we can accept the validity of your homosexual experience and your attraction. You also wouldn't be able to predict it from the parents of this person, because oftentimes there are two heterosexual parents. So it's not like, well, you're the offspring of one of the parents is gay or whatever. And so therefore, it makes sense biologically that the descendant would also have these traits. So the point is there's nothing genetic you can point to validate this experience. So all we really have to go off of is, number one, the reported internal experience that they tell us, where they say, they tell us like, yeah, I'm attracted to dudes versus women, and this is my experience. And then at number two, there's also the fact that they act in accordance with it. They don't just make the claim. They also live as a homosexual. Like, they suck penises and get fucked in the ass and stuff like that. Pretty powerful confirmatory evidence. I mean, you want to talk about hard evidence, And then number three is the psychological community, the medical experts, the psychological experts. They then come out and say, yes, this is normal, it's healthy, it's non-pathological, and it's a valid experience that they're having. And for most of us, this is enough. There are some homosexual deniers out there who reject homosexuality, and they say, you're not actually gay, you're just a sinner, it's just Satan has polluted your minds, and, really deep down, you're a heterosexual, and you just need to pray the gay away. For the most part, these people don't have much currency in society these days. Most of us, if someone tells us they're gay, they live as a gay person, and the psychological community is like, yeah, homosexuality, it's a thing that's valid. For most of us, we accept it, and we're just like, yeah, of course. And the circumstances are actually very similar for transsexualism, where you wouldn't predict the internal state from just looking at the genome, because you look at the chromosomes, and you're like, there's nothing in the chromosomes that would lead us to necessarily believe that a person would have this internal state. There's nothing you can point to there. Same with the sex orientation or gender orientation of the parents, where it's like neither parent is transgender, so you wouldn't predict it from that in terms of like heritability. But similar to homosexuals, like what we just saw, number one, they report the internal experience to us. They say, this is the way I feel, and this is the experience I have. Number two, they act very strongly in accordance with it in terms of gender reassignment surgery and like hormone treatment and things of that nature. And then number three, the psychological experts, the medical community, they come out and say, yes, this is normal. It's a valid, healthy experience. There's nothing mentally ill or pathological about it. And they say that it's totally fine. So really it's very similar to homosexuality in that sense, where the same, three criteria points that we use to accept homosexuality, they're there for transsexuality as well. So it's like, if there's no solid foundation for rejecting it in the case of homosexuals, you wouldn't go up to a gay person and be like, I don't think you actually are attracted to men. I think you're lying about it. For the most part, most of us accept what they tell us based on those three criteria points. Why not do the same for transsexuals is the question that I have. Now, the Republican, Ben Shapiro, he almost certainly wouldn't have a problem, or he wouldn't deny or argue with the fact that, number one, yes, transgender people are having the internal experience. Shapiro doesn't claim that transgender people are lying about it, He also probably wouldn't argue with the fact that they're acting strongly in accordance with it when they get gender reassignment surgery. His argument would basically just be, yeah, they believe this and they act in accordance with it, but it's a mental illness, it's delusions. And this is something that he says quite explicitly. So really that's the one thing that he would disagree with, is whether it actually is a psychologically healthy and normal and valid internal experience to have. That would be his point of disagreement. And the thing is, it's not his fucking decision to make. Like the medical community, the psychologists, the experts, the researchers who study this field and specialize in this, the PhDs and the fucking researchers who look at different mental and psychological states and make the determinations as to what's pathological, what's delusional, what's a mental illness, what's a normal, healthy state. There are fucking experts and people who work in this field, and they're the ones that decide this shit. It's not Ben Shapiro that decides this for the world. And so the consensus among all these professionals, all the top organizations and top experts, whether we're talking the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, the consensus among all of them is it is a mentally healthy and valid and normal and non-delusional mental state. So really the only grounds on which Ben Shapiro disagrees with the validity of transsexualism is on a criteria point that all the relevant experts and organizations in this field just flatly contradict what he's saying. So now that we've accepted, number one, the internal experience of transgender people, we accept that they're having the internal experience of transgenderism. Now that we've accepted, number two, that they're acting in accordance with it by undergoing gender reassignment surgery and hormone therapy and so forth, we've accepted, number three, the psychological community, the mental health community, the medical community, all these top relevant organizations, they all agree that it's healthy and it's normal and it's not indicative of mental illness for those people. And we've accepted, number four, these expert organizations are much more reliable and trustworthy sources of information on this question than right-wing radio host Ben Shapiro. All we're really left with this at this point is just the technical semantic conversation of definitions, labels, what terminology are we going to specifically use? And this is like the last remaining bastion that conservatives have left to hide inside of. And fundamentally, this is one of the big sticking points for them, where it's just like, what is the definition of a man versus a woman? Sometimes Shapiro, he makes arguments along these lines where, to sort of back his case on this, he'll say things like, you can't claim to be something you're not. For example, you can't change your age.
Dan, why? Okay, let me ask you this. I won't ask you how old. I will ask you how old you are, okay? Because you're young enough that it's probably not insulting to ask you. So
I'm 22, so I'm probably only naive, right?
No, why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60?
Because it,
And why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
And this is one of those videos that definitely went viral, and a lot of people just love this clip, and they're like, yes, you're fucking 23 years old, you can't claim that you're 60, like transgenderism debunked. And then sometimes you'll have Republicans make a bunch of other silly analogies where they're like, oh, you identify as a woman, even though you were born biologically male. Well, I identify as an attack helicopter. And they all just applaud each other and just have a good laugh about it. And I'm just like, dude, the difference is the claims that you're making in these analogies, none of them are being made in good faith. Like, a transgender person isn't claiming to have their internal experience to try to make a clever point or to try to own the libs at a Q&A session. It's like, this is their actual internal experience that they're having. And it's not just like a funny thing they're saying to try to be clever. And, it's not just that they're having the experience, but it's also an experience that's validated by the medical community and the psychological community as totally appropriate and healthy and normal for these people. And, to compare that to just like, I identify as an attack helicopter. I mean, it's really fucking silly, and it's really juvenile, and it's not a claim that anyone is making in good faith. So it's just like, why don't we cut the shit with the stupid fucking analogies and just talk about what we're actually talking about? Now, a good way to illustrate the absurdity of the conservative position, specifically regarding the chromosomes argument, where they say, male chromosomes, it's a man forever. Female chromosomes, it's a woman forever, end of conversation. If you look at the case of hermaphrodites or intersexuals, it really puts them in an awkward position where their arguments just really kind of fall apart. Hermaphrodites, these are people who are actually born with both the male and the female sex chromosomes, and also both the male and the female sex organs. So, you'll have somebody who they're born and they don't fall into the one or the two categories. They have both chromosomes of both sexes. And what typically ends up happening is they tend to go down one of the two gender paths. Sometimes the parents, based upon which genitals predominate when they're very young, they tend to just sort of push them down that one. Oftentimes the parents just allow them to decide when they're older which one kind of conforms better to their experience and feels best for them. And this is actually very similar to what happens with transsexuals, because they have two sets of chromosomes. So you wouldn't necessarily predict that they would have one internal experience that predominates. But typically that's actually what happens with intersexuals, where it's like, they may have been born with both sexual organs, but you'll have a certain intersexual individual who internally they feel like a woman. And it's just like, that's their internal state. And so they end up going down that path. And you would look at the chromosomes and you wouldn't predict this from the internal experience. But this is what ends up happening with them. Just because, like I said earlier, the psychology, the conscious experience of the internal state, it's separate from the chromosomes. Because there's more that goes into psychology than just your fucking chromosomes. And so really intersexuals, I think, are a good bridge to sort of understand this incongruence between a person's sex at birth and the gender identity that they have internally. Because, here it's the same thing, you're looking at the chromosomes, but there's just an incongruence that's very similar to what we see with transsexuals. So if it's acceptable and valid and normal and healthy for intersexuals, why not transsexuals as well, is a question that I have. And I think probably the more important point about this is that it actually just completely inverts the Republican logic and just makes them look really fucking stupid. Because the case they make is you look at the chromosomes and that's how you decide what to call a person or what their gender is. So by that logic, shouldn't Republicans view hermaphrodites as both simultaneously a man and a woman? Because, that's the criteria they use here. What are they going to do in terms of names? Like, if they have a coworker who transitions from a born biological male to a woman, and they're like, I used to be Sheldon. I'd like you to call me Shelby now. And, they tend to resist this and use the male name. But it's like, what the fuck are they going to do for a hermaphrodite? Are they going to do like a combined male-female name where it's like, I'm going to call you Shelby Sheldon? Gender pronouns, are they going to use the term he, she, he, where it's like, where's he, she at right now? I think he, she is on her lunch break. you know? Because again, that's the fucking logic they use here, is the pronouns need to correspond to the chromosomes. Then you get into shit like the bathroom argument, or the locker room argument. What fucking bathroom are these people going to use? It's like, is Ben Shapiro going to say that you need to take a dump in the men's room, but wash your hands in the fucking women's room? Like, you can shower in the men's locker room, but I insist that you towel off in the women's room, because you're both a male and a fucking woman. So really the point of this is the same logic that they use to try to illustrate how transgenderism is silly, because look at all these conclusions about the gender pronouns and the implications of that. Really the same logic and criteria that they use here kind of turns the point they're making on its head. Because all the silly shit that they claim is ridiculous, the pronouns and, you know, the policies about like bathrooms and locker rooms, their criteria and logic forces them to do the same kind of shit that they claim is ridiculous. I would also invite you to ask if chromosomes are fundamentally what it even comes down to for Republicans like Ben Shapiro on this. I think a good way to investigate this is just to ask, generally speaking, what is the right-wing response to transvestites versus transsexuals? Transvestites, this is somebody also known as cross-dressers. It's somebody who they don't necessarily identify as a woman. Like, their internal state might not necessarily be like, yeah, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body. It's just, you might just have a guy who likes to just put on a dress every now and then and just dress up like a woman, like Steven Crowder does. And, you look at transvestites and it's just like, they're not claiming to actually be the opposite gender. So on the basis of this Ben Shapiro chromosomal argument, presumably that means that Republicans are going to welcome transvestites with open arms and say, it's totally fine, dude. You want to put a fucking dress on? As long as you're not making claims about your chromosomes, I'm cool with it, and we can be friends, and I fully accept you. Is that what Republicans do, or do they treat transvestites with the same sort of disdain and ridicule that they do transsexuals? I think we all know the answer to this. So with that in mind, I would just sort of invite you to ask yourself, like, does this really come down to the detailed nuances of genetics and chromosomes for them? Like that fucking Republican posting a comment on a YouTube video about genetics and chromosomes. I mean, honestly, how many fucking books on genetics do you think that guy owns? Does it really come down to, I just have such a deep and abiding passion for the detailed nuances of genetic science? Is that what it is? Or is it just transgenders and transvestites kind of creep them out and freak them out a little bit? And so they kind of decide that they don't like them, and then they work backwards from that position. Again, in my opinion, the case of transvestites makes pretty clear what the answer is. Now, Republicans, they'll also make arguments like, look, you're saying to me there's a person who can feel internally like a woman, even though they have a penis. Ben Shapiro, he'll harp on the penis. I mean, this guy's obsessed with the penis. It's a little, you want to talk pathological. He's always talking about, like, the internal state as a woman, but this person has a penis, and that's not ridiculous to you? And I'm just like, dude, I don't think you understand that's literally what transgenderism is. Like, transgenderism is literally the incongruence between a person's sex at birth and, like, the outward physical fucking shell that they have, and the internal state of what they, what gender they feel like they are. That's why they use the fucking term woman trapped in a man's body to explain this. So, like, it's not news to anybody for you to point out, like, this person, they identify as a woman and feel like a woman, but they have a penis. It's like, that's not news to anybody. That person's not going to look down and be like, what the fuck? Where did that come from? Like, he's right. There's a penis there. Like, this isn't news to the medical or psychological community. That's a literal description of what transgenderism is. It's that incongruence between the psychological perception of what gender they are and then the outward fucking shell that they have. And that's the whole point of gender reassignment surgery in hormone therapy. It's to correct and reconcile that incongruence, to sort of bridge that disconnect. And I really think the conservative position on this just comes down to their fundamental inability to just empathize with other people on this. And I don't mean that in the sense of like a jab in a YouTube video where it's like, Republicans are mean. I mean the literal definition of empathize, where it's like to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and positions and like think about and understand their experience as opposed to yours. Because a lot of the Republicans that make these arguments, especially on YouTube, it's for whatever reason, a lot of fucking political viewers on subjects like these are mostly male. And so what you have is a person who's a straight man, and that's his experience, where it's like, I have a male body and I have a male personality, and this is my experience, where it's like, I have the dick and I have the male mindset to go with it, where I like sports and, you know, attractive women turn me on and shit. And it like, they have that congruence. And so for them to imagine anything other than this, they look at that and they're like, that's mental illness. That's a delusion. But transgenderism, it doesn't fucking work the way that their mind and their body works. You know, again, transgenderism is literally that fucking incongruence, where it's like a woman trapped in a man's body. So, I mean, honestly, for a lot of these people who reject transgenderism, if they would just stop and just fucking think for a second, like, what would this really actually be like? Like, imagine you know, you're a guy with a heterosexual male mindset. You've lived your whole fucking life that way. What if you woke up tomorrow, like, actually imagine this. What if you woke up tomorrow, same personality, same memories, same experiences, but for whatever fucking reason, you wake up in some parallel universe where you have a female woman's body. And you're the same person, same personality, and you're just like, dude, I'm not in the right fucking body. Like, I'm a man, but I'm in this outward female shell. That's basically what the experience of transgenderism is like for a lot of these individuals. And, you know, so regarding the definitions of like, well, what's your criteria for what a man actually is or what a woman actually is? For Republicans, what it comes down to for them is like, look at the chromosomes, look what they were born with. But for me, and for the medical community and the fucking psychologists and experts in this field, what it comes down to is just taking them at their word when they say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. That's the experience they have, and it's an experience that I accept as valid, and it's one that the medical community and the psychological community accepts as well. It's just like, you know, a gay man tells you that he's attracted to men. I take him at his word that that's his experience, you know? Like, I don't need to probe inside of his fucking mind with a magnifying glass or try to pathologize it. I'm just like, okay, fine. Like, that's your fucking experience. I don't care. And, you know, when the medical and the psychological community agrees with this and says nothing wrong with it, it's not delusional, this is their actual fucking perception, then I'm just going to use the gender pronoun or the fucking name or the term that they identify with, and I'm just not going to be a fucking asshole about it. Another criteria that I like to use for this with thinking about, you know, the technical definitions of what's a man versus a woman, you know, what's the definitional criteria that you use here? A really good one that I think is helpful is literally who gives a fuck. Like, who gives a fuck? Mind your fucking business. That's my criteria. Like, who fucking cares? I mean, like, why do we need to inspect the fucking genitals of somebody before we have a conversation with them? Or decide, you know, what name to call them? Like, what do you have to gain here by just intentionally going out of your fucking way to be a dick about it? You know, these are people, they just want to live their life and just mind their fucking business. They're not going to stick their fucking trans penis in your mouth. They certainly don't want to spend any time around your fucking right-wing ass. They literally just want to live their life and mind their business. And for me, it's the same with names and gender pronouns and all of that shit. It's like somebody who used to be named Shelby wants to be called Sheldon. Who fucking cares? Somebody, you know, I used to go by he. I'd like to go by she now. Like, literally, dude, who fucking cares? It's the same number of syllables. It doesn't impact your life in any way. Like, it's a fucking word. It's a name. It's just like, this is the hill you're going to die on. Quibbling about semantics and definitions like this. I'm just like, honestly, dude, just who fucking cares? That's another criteria that I think we should use on this. And, you know, somebody tells me, use this name, use this pronoun. I'm not going to argue with them. I'm not going to be a fucking asshole about it. I'm just going to identify them by the gender that they claim corresponds to their internal experience. And that's what it comes down to for me. And, you know, like, is there any better example of just bending over backwards and going out of your way to be a fucking asshole than just purposefully using the wrong gender pronoun? How's it going, sir? Just like, come on, dude. Like, what do you have to gain from that? Just being a fucking dick on purpose like that. Fundamentally, what this disagreement really comes down to regarding, you know, the definitions and labels of a man versus a woman is Republicans insist that the gender labels, they come from your outward physical shell, the physical body that you have, the sex at birth, the chromosomes that you have, and for them, that's the fucking line they draw. But what the psychologists and the experts in this field tell us is that we should use the gender label that corresponds to that inward experience. And biologically, I would argue this makes sense, because, like I pointed out, psychology and cognition are not necessarily 100% the product of your chromosomes. There doesn't need to be 100% correspondence, because psychology and cognition, it's much more complicated than that. You know, other factors, genetics, developmental factors, they can play a role. So biologically, it makes sense to use the gender label that corresponds to this. And if you look at the reasons that Republicans refuse to use that gender label, the gender pronoun that a person identifies with, it's number one, they claim that a person's cognitive mental experience needs to correspond to their chromosomes, their outward physical traits. There's no reason for that. There's no psychological brain science justification for that. Number two, some of them reject the inward experience in terms of, claiming that it's delusional or pathological. And, number three, they flat out say that this is a mental illness and it's not a valid state. And on all three counts, they're just wrong about this. So what I would therefore contend is that also makes them wrong about which labels and which gender pronouns to use here. If you look out at the world, at, all the different people, all the different types of, psychological states and sexual states, there's a lot of variation. You have heterosexuals, you have homosexuals, you have bisexuals, you have asexuals, you have intersexuals. So my question is, why not also transsexuals? Why would it be so fucking hard to believe that this is also a mental psychological state when there's so much variety out there? So many different cognitive mental states, like, why not this one also? What it really seems to come down to when you look at this right-wing resistance to accepting transgenders into this community, really what it seems to come down to is transgenders are just the newest ones to the party. And typical reactionary conservatism, anything that's new or different from what they're used to or from what their experience is, it's a typical reactionary and maybe even to a certain extent just a universal human response. Anything new, unusual, you've never seen it before, outside of your experience. Sometimes, people, it's gross to them, it's weird to them, it freaks them out, it makes them uncomfortable. And I think really a large part of the conservative viewpoint on the subject comes from that. And I would argue the case of transvestites versus transsexuals backs that up. 20, 30 years from now, transgenders, they're going to be much more accepted in society. And I really do think that we're going to look back on YouTube videos with titles like, Ben Shapiro destroys transgenderism. We're going to look back on videos like that as just as vile as if we saw a video today that was like, Ben Shapiro destroys homosexuality. Steven Crowder debunks lesbianism. I mean, if you saw something like that, you'd be like, what the fuck is this shit? Like, what are these idiots talking about? And I really do think that we're not going to be able to believe that there was this much hatred and ridicule and disdain for a group of people purely on the basis of their gender identity and an internal cognitive state that it's just their experience that they fucking have. And, people like Ben Shapiro, as smart as he thinks he is, 20, 30 years from now when society has moved forward and become much more accepting of transgenders, people like Shapiro, they're going to look really, really fucking stupid for having said and advocated these positions and done so publicly and so forcefully. So if there are any transgender people watching who are considering suicide, I would recommend that you stick around because you don't want to miss out on that. Trust me. This is one of many, many issues where Republicans, they're just on the wrong side of history and they're just behind the times. I'm on Patreon. There's a link in the bio if you'd like to support my content. I'd really appreciate it. You can also follow me on social media there. Links in the bio. If you want to help me build up some of those followings, I would appreciate it. Subscribe, hit the bell. You know the fucking drill. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this.